RG. And I wanted to ask you both to talk for a moment about how your backgrounds and how you arrived at your theories. And Jared Diamond, you write a fascinating introduction to your book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, about your background in New Guinea and studying as a scientist and studying, among other things, birds.
That's right. My background in New Guinea was that I went out to New Guinea in 1964 to study birds, knowing that New Guineans are what are called primitive people, which means that they were using stone tools, they didn't have writing, they didn't have much in the way of clothing, and they didn't have chief states or empires. I went out there naive, figuring that these people were primitive in their technology because they were primitive in their minds, primitive mentally, the usual naive racist preconceptions. And it took me literally about one day in New Guinea to discover that these are really smart people, at least as curious and engaged and intelligent as my American and Japanese and European friends. So what was the reason why these smart people ended up with stone tools? The question arose for me in 1964, and I gradually realized, took me about 25 years to realize it, that it had to do not with differences between the people, but everything to do with differences between the environments, namely that New Guinea had no domesticable animals and few domesticable plants, and the same difference applies when you compare the Eurasian continent versus either Africa or the New World, though to a lesser degree, that Eurasia was just much richer in domesticable plants and animals, larger continent, and so Eurasia got a huge head start of thousands of years over even Africa, North America, and South America in getting people to settle down in villages, live in complex societies, and develop all those powerful weapons that ended up winning the Battle of Midway in the Napoleonic Wars.
And Victor Davis Hanson, your background, grew up on a farm in North California and as a professor of classics.
Yes, I was a classical philologist, and I was struck as I began to study military history that most of the usual explanations for the rise of the West were not, I didn't find all that convincing, either that it was a late development of the Industrial Revolution, because I knew the legacy of Greece, or it was because of gunpowder, which I knew was also late, and to be frank, the geographical explanations. And so over the years, I began to look at battles in a very detailed way, and I came to the conclusion that there was a tradition that began with Hellenism, and before that tradition, that is before 2,500 years, the embryo where that arose was a very primitive country. It was underpopulated. It had no navigable rivers. It had very low population densities. It had no cultural, I didn't feel it had a very rich cultural tradition before it. The Mycenaeans had been completely wiped out. And while the Greeks had borrowed things from other peoples, both in art and in alphabet, what they did to them was quite unique. And then for me, the rise of Western military power meant that it was a gift, an accidental gift perhaps, had nothing to do with genes or anything. It was just the miracle of the human experience in Greece. And that also meant that the usual explanations I found that when the West was weak, for example, in the Dark Ages or during the medieval period or even during the Renaissance, you still see that Europe is pretty much pristine and projecting military power, whether it's the Crusades or a divided Europe between Orthodoxy, Protestantism, and Catholicism, still holding the Ottomans at bay. So it seemed to me a very dynamic tradition, but I couldn't trace it anywhere before the 7th century in Greece.
Let's go back to the phones again. Our number, 800-989-8255. Our next caller is Todd, who's on the line with us from Cleveland.
Hi. I'm actually an instructor in modern world history at a college here. I'm a graduate student in U.S. history. But what I wanted to point out is that to claim this so-called Western tradition is very much a 19th century tradition of claiming Greece, and I think even just in the lead-in to present history as 2,500 years of unbroken so-called Western domination is kind of inaccurate. I mean, we need to remember the Arab Empire that preserved Greek and Roman wisdom while Europe was in the so-called Dark Ages. There's a reason why we've been shifting to world history away from traditional Western civilization courses. There's a lot of problems with just considering this as one tradition, one rubric that's unbroken. there was very little of Europe that geographically that consisted of the Greek or Roman empires, actually, just the southern fringe of the Mediterranean. There have been historians who've noted links to Africa, especially to Egypt, like Berdal. There have been historians who've argued that the reason that Europeans set off in looking for conquest, power, goods was because they were economically poor in relation to China. China had no need to go voyaging around the globe in search of any kind of manufactured products. I mean, Europe's chief export in 1500 was wool. So I just wanted to see how the professors would consider that premise.
Well, Victor Hanson, some of that seems to be directed at you.
Yes, it does. Well, I mean, nobody would deny that there was a cross-fertilization across the Mediterranean. There was great cultural achievements of every Islam, the Ottomans, Africa. But what's unique is that the Greeks and Western tradition, as we define it in the classical tradition, is anti-Mediterranean. Almost every idea, from local control to private property to constitutional law to consent of the governed to rational tradition, is a Western idea. So it is unique, and what's interesting about world history is how that allows a very small people in a very small land to achieve power that's not commiserate otherwise. But as far as Islam, they have been great Islamic mathematicians, but the question is, why is it that their genius was not disseminated in a wide fashion to the population? In the 16th century, Spanish and Swiss ballistics manuals don't reflect a higher degree of knowledge than what was going on in the Islamic world, but they do reach far more people because of the marriage between rationalism and capitalism in a way that Islam is not. Every time an Islamic scientist had a brilliant idea, he found himself isolated either by government coercion or reactions from Islamic fundamentalism. So his ideas remained among a small Mandarin elite in a way that was somewhat true of China as well.
But it's somewhat deterministic to assume that the so-called West, as in the European intellectual establishment or governments, were interested in disseminating knowledge to the people. I mean, one theory is that occurred as a result of the Reformation, which was somewhat of a social movement, spread literacy and kind of took on a life of its own. Some of this knowledge wasn't intended to get out to the population. I guess I'm just...
Oh, excuse me, that's not quite correct, because there was literacy at 30 to 40 or 50% in classical antiquity. That's not the proper historical question. Why it's intended. It's not intended to help anybody. It's just insidious.
I'm just concerned that this has become somewhat deterministic, that the West always has dominated and by implication always will dominate, and I'll end here and take your comments off the air.
Okay, thanks very much for your call, Todd. And I wondered if you wanted to get in on that, Jared Diamond.
Sure, I would make some comments. I think the caller's basic point has to do with seeing Europe in a wider context. It's an approach in history associated with a movement called world history today, with which I'm quite sympathetic. Just to get some perspective on history, because the field of history, as we know it today, arose professionally in the 19th century at the time when nation-states were being formed. History has traditionally been pursued by people whose specialty is one place for one century. So the job ads in the history journals read for a 19th century French historian and a 16th century Dutch historian. The problem is that you can't understand even a small area for a small time without a larger context. For example, if what you care about is 19th century France, you can't understand 19th century France without knowing why it was different from 16th century France, or without knowing why France at that time was different from, say, Italy at that time. To go back, for example, to the point that Professor Hanson raised at the beginning, this very interesting point about the difference between the histories of Greece and Spain, two really salient long-term points there, which you get as soon as you look at a map, is that the coast of Greece is highly indented and the coast of Spain, of the Iberian Peninsula, is not, and that Greece lies immediately adjacent to Asia Minor, whereas Spain lies as far as possible. And the result is that all of those interesting things that arose in the Fertile Crescent, including writing systems, arrived in Europe first in Greece, 7000 BC, agriculture, and the last place they arrived was Spain.
Did you? I'm sorry, I just couldn't hear. Did you say writing systems or riding systems, like horses?
Both, actually.
Okay.
Horses first, about 4000 BC, and then writing systems, the writing,
Yes.
as you write on paper nowadays. The first writing arrived in Greece something like, it's attested, 1800 BC, but writing arose in the Fertile Crescent 3400 BC, and all that the Greeks did was to add vowels to writing systems that had been preformed to the east. So that shows how the perspective of world history that our caller raised really is an essential perspective.
Okay. Let's go on to another call, and now AJ joins us on the line from Concord, New Hampshire.
Hello. I've got a question I'd like to pose to either one of your guests. And it pertains to China, which you were talking about a couple of minutes back.
Mm-hmm.
Was the failure of China to rise to, the stratospheric levels of the Indo-European, Indo-Aryan peoples in world affairs and world dominance, was that attributable, do you think, to China's decision at a certain point in its history leading up to the Opium War with the British? Do you think that was attributable to their decision to cut off from the rest of the world, turn their backs to the rest of the world, look inwards, and become the Middle Kingdom?
I could comment on that because it began much earlier. It's not China's turning inwards at the time of the Opium Wars. Just to get a perspective on this, remember that until 1400, China led the world, including Europe, in almost everything essential. China had by far the biggest, most numerous, and best ships. China had invented gunpowder, paper, printing, compasses, kites, deep drilling, and all that other stuff. So the real question is why China began to lose its enormous lead, and that began in the 1400s. China was sending out fleets of ships that sailed to India, Arabia, east coast of Africa, and looked as if 1432, as if China was on the verge of rounding the Cape and then colonizing and conquering Africa and Europe from the east, but it didn't happen. So China began to turn inwards in the 1400s as a result of an accident of its unity. There were a series of emperors. Eventually there came an emperor who said, we've had enough of these fleets, waste of money, let's close down the fleets. That's happened in the history of European countries and the United States, but in China, because there was only one emperor instead of the hundreds of princes in Europe, when the emperor decided to close down the fleets, Chinese Columbus had no chance, whereas in Europe, when Columbus got no support in Italy or France or Portugal or three different dukes of Spain, Columbus eventually on his seventh try got support, and that is a metaphor for why Europe overtook China.
You're listening. Just a sec. You're listening to Talk of the Nation from NPR News. Go ahead, Victor.
I would just like to say that this idea that history starts in Europe as a Eurocentric product of the nation-state is fallacious. No historical tradition has been as interested in the other as the West. Whether you can go back to Herodotus and read him, what is really insular is Chinese history and Arabic historians. They seem to not be as interested in the West as the West is in them. As far as Spain, well, we could go very close and say Italy. It has indented coastline. It has major islands. Yet in 700 BC, Italy was a backward country. And then as far as Greece, all of that cultural tradition in some sense was obliterated. So by 700 BC, it had no advantages whatsoever. It was inward. It was subject to nomadic invasions from the north. It was next to an empire of 70 million that wanted to destroy it. And yet this curious culture sort of came out of nowhere. And finally, about China, I think it starts much earlier, and it gets back to this idea that there is not the same tradition of dissent and open discussion in the West that the Western. You can look at a military manual, let's say 400 BC, brilliant one by Sun Tzu, in some ways more brilliant than anything published in the West. But if we look at a Western military tradition, a tactician, for example, same time, Aeneas Tacticus. Sun Tzu says, if you want to discover how to fight, you must know the hot and the cold, the yin and the yang. Aeneas Tacticus says, if you want to take a city, you go under, over, or through, and this is how you do it. So Western knowledge and rationalism is much more amoral. It's not embedded with philosophical discussion, religious questions, but it's much more dependent on answering the particular question that's posed and then disseminating the knowledge and then being rewarded for it.
Is there an example? Is there an example you could cite? an instance through history. Go ahead.